All right, Alexander, it looks like we have the conclusion to one conflict, and that has been taking place in Africa, and that is the conflict in Ethiopia. Do we have a peace deal? Has this conflict come to an end?
Yes.
Are the neocons going to allow this conflict to come to an end? I think that's an interesting question there. So, what has happened in Ethiopia?
Right. The first thing to say is we have a peace deal, and it is between Ethiopia and the Tigray movement. And if you remember, there's been a civil war in Ethiopia, and it all arose because of a conflict between the federal authorities, the Ethiopian federal authorities in Addis Ababa, and the Tigray regional authorities. Tigray had previously dominated the central Ethiopian government. It lost control. It tried to reassert control, it seems, of the central Ethiopian government. It also tried to forge its own autonomy. It became increasingly clear that the Tigrayans were acting with the backing of the neocons in the United States. There had been recordings of conversations between the Tigrayans and top American officials, which to my mind make that indisputable. I don't think there's any doubt about this at all. So this is clearly a US-backed insurrection against the government in Ethiopia, which had previously seemed, when it was under Tigrayan control, fairly closely aligned with the US, but with a current Ethiopian government, which has instead tilted much more towards China and Russia. So there was a geopolitical aspect to this conflict, and for a while, it looked like the Tigrayans were winning. They seemed to have a very tough force. That we did a program when the Tigrayan army seemed to be a few miles from Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital. There was talk that Addis Ababa might fall. The Ethiopians apparently mobilized a huge army. They aligned themselves with Eritrea. They counterattacked. And what's happened suddenly is that Tigray agreed to this peace proposal on the 2nd of November, which effectively concedes. It's a capitulation. They seem to be accepting that federal authorities to be re-established in Tigray, that the Tigrayan forces are to disarm, and on the face of it, the war has therefore ended. Except, of course, we're now getting reports that some people in Washington are very unhappy. They're trying to put pressure on the Ethiopian government. I've been contacted by somebody who's in the know who tells me that the US is now trying to close down the Ethiopian national airline, that there's threats of sanctions against Ethiopia. They're trying to get the entire deal renegotiated. So it's not yet fully over. But on the face of it, it has been another geostrategic defeat for the United States. And one of the most interesting things about this conflict is that when it began, when the Tigrayans appeared to be winning, there was article after article about it in the Western media. I mean, the British media was full of articles about what was going on in this war. All of them, by the way, heavily slanted in the Tigrayans' favour. And now that there's been this peace agreement, there's been no coverage at all. I haven't seen a single article in the British media that even alludes to this fact.
Why was or why is the U.S., the neocons, and the UK, the deep state in the UK, why are they so antagonistic towards Ethiopia?
This is a very, very good question. I mean, Ethiopia is I should say it's big. As African countries go, it's big. It has a very, very long history. It was never fully occupied by the European powers. It always managed to secure its independence from the European powers, except for a brief period in the late 30s and early 40s when it was occupied by fascist Italy, Mussolini's Italy. The headquarters of the African Union, I believe, in Addis Ababa. It was always been a supporter of African independence. It supported the African movements against the colonial empires. And so, I mean, there is that. There are all those factors. But I think overriding everything, Ethiopia potentially is a rich country. Before the war, it had a very high economic growth rate, for example. So it's potentially a rich country. And of course, with the neocons, there's always this obsessive geopolitical chess game they play. They see Africa now as another, part of the board where the game is being played out principally against the Chinese. They're talking about Chinese influence growing in parts of Africa. They're worried that the West African states are tilting towards the Russians, all that kind of thing. So they wanted to keep Ethiopia either on side, or if they couldn't, they wanted to basically break it up, weakening, therefore, a major African country that was tilting towards the Eurasian bloc, and, well, they failed.
Is that where Ethiopia is going to go now?
Yes, I think it is.
Is it going to go the way of BRICS? And what does that mean for Africa? If then you have, say, you have South Africa, then you have Ethiopia, what does that mean for the continent to look at these two countries and say, our future really does lie
with the BRICS? With the BRICS. I mean, the nearest approximation to this, by the way, came in the 60s and 70s when Africa again became a chessboard of geopolitical struggle between the two superpowers of that era, which is the United States and the Soviet Union. But of course, the big difference then was that the Soviets did not have the economic reach that the Eurasians do today. So even countries in the 1960s and 70s in Africa that aligned themselves politically with the Soviets had to maintain economic relations with the West, and that always limited the amount of Soviet influence in Africa. This time it's different because the Chinese and the Russians can provide Africa with all the development assistance it needs in rivalry to that of the United States. And of course, the prize, as the neocons would say, is Africa's resources, which are huge. Now, of course, the Eurasians insist that they are not there to exploit Africa, that they're there to work with the Africans and to develop Africa in partnership, as opposed to the Western powers, which have an extractive approach to Africa. I know an awful lot of people are cynical about that. To some extent, I am. But anyway, the fact is that one can see that, given the history, one can see why African states are probably saying to themselves increasingly, well, the Eurasians are the coming force, they're the rising power, and they can give us all we need. They tell us that they're coming with good intentions. Perhaps we don't trust this 100%, but we know from our experience how exploitative the Western powers are, so let's tilt to the Eurasians.
It does seem like the Western powers are leaving. They're pulling out of Africa. I mean, I'm thinking about France, the moves that France has made in the past couple of months, and it does seem, if you go by at least the speeches that Putin has given, say in the past 2-3 months, it does seem like the approach from the BRICS is going to be more of a cooperative approach. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but it seems like Eurasia is also sensing that as Europe leaves, because they just can't stay there anymore. It's clear that they can't stay there anymore. They probably don't have the economic means to stay there anymore. As they leave, the BRICS sense an opportunity, but perhaps they sense a different way of working with the countries in Africa that are seeing, the French and other Western countries just bolt.
Exactly. Well, I think you're right because first of all, I think the Eurasians. We discussed that speech Putin gave a few weeks ago, which he talked about, cooperation between countries, an end to exploitation, an end to the sort of neo-colonial mechanisms that the Western powers have followed, the fact that we're not seeking to replace one hegemony with another. So the Eurasians know, even if they don't perhaps fully mean it, though I think Putin himself personally does mean it. But anyway, the Eurasians know the right things to say to win the Africans over. And certainly the Russians, I don't know so much about the Chinese, but certainly the Russians seem to know how to pitch the message to Africa exactly right. I mean, if you listen to British media, for example, television and radio media, it's very interesting that the only sort of pro-Russian comments you ever hear nowadays tend to come from African speakers. You know, BBC journalists go to an African country, talk to Africans there, and the Africans talk back, and they say, well, actually, you know, the Russians aren't acting wrongly, they're not acting inappropriately in Ukraine, you know, they've got their point, they're on our side, we're on their side. You actually get that. Now, the other thing I think that's happening, and I think this is the great paradox of it, is that I think the Western powers are paying the price increasingly for their fixation with Ukraine. I know this sounds bizarre, given that, you know, it's the Russians who are involved in the conflict there. You would expect that the Russians would be single-mindedly focused on Ukraine. But they're not. You have Putin making all of these speeches. You have Lavrov touring the Middle East, Lavrov touring Africa. You have the Russians negotiating with the Turks about grain and fertilizer. You have the Chinese obviously doing things on an even bigger scale. And whereas it's the Western powers that are going to all of these countries and they're saying, you know, you must take sides with us on this Ukrainian thing. And you know, they seem to be totally monomaniacally fixated on Ukraine. And the result is that, as you correctly said, the French position in West Africa is now in progressive collapse. American influence in Africa seems to be in decline. British influence has all but collapsed as well. And it seems that the Westerners are so fixated with Ukraine at the moment that they don't even really notice or care ultimately. I mean, Macron has made some rather, you know, sobbing comments about this, you know, the bad Russians coming in and all that and how they're cutting us out. But ultimately, you would have thought that the Western powers would be very, very concerned, and they don't seem to be. We've done a program just a short while ago about the situation in the Middle East, how Western influence seems to be collapsing in the Middle East. We're seeing the same thing happen in Africa. We're probably going to start seeing the same thing happen in Asia and Latin America. And all energy, all political energy in the West is focused on Ukraine.
Yeah, they've taken all their chips and they've put them all in on Ukraine. Everything they've had, they've put it all in on Ukraine, and they're going to lose.
Exactly.
It's crystal clear they're going to lose. And they've bet it all there. They haven't hedged in one direction or another. They've bet it all on Ukraine. And you have opportunities now opening up everywhere.
Absolutely. It's a very, I mean, I'm changing the topic and, you know, going a bit off topic. I mean, Lula, the new president of Brazil, has given a very interesting series of indications about the kind of policies that Brazil is going to follow under his presidency. And he talks about, you know, multipolar policies and, seeking friendship first and foremost with China, though not at the expense of the US, and all of these kind of things. But you can, but also reviving all the structures that Hugo Chavez created in Latin America. So you can see how all of this is happening. For us in Washington, they're single-mindedly looking at Ukraine. And not even to start about Europe, where, I mean, you know, we got no energy for anything else at the moment. We're not even looking at our own affairs. I mean, that's let alone what's going on in Africa or Latin America or such places.
I have to say the pull for multipolarity, I think, is just becoming too strong. I think the momentum is just too much now. There's no way that the collective West, that the U.S. is going to be able to pull things back to a unipolar world now. I think the
I agree
momentum
with
is
that.
just way too much in the multipolar direction. And Ethiopia, countries of Africa, you mentioned Brazil. I think everyone senses it. The program we did about the Middle East, everyone senses that the momentum's already there, and there's
Exactly.
no going back.
Exactly. Exactly. It is. I think that's exactly correct. I think that's exactly what's happening, and that's exactly what we're seeing. I mean, the
All right,
contrast, as I said, with the coverage this war in Ethiopia used to get, and the complete lack of interest in it now, it's just bizarre. It's just surreal.
Is Ethiopia? Do you know if Ethiopia has taken any steps towards the SCO or BRICS
Oh
or anything
yes,
like
oh
that?
yes,
Or
absolutely. I mean, Abiy, the prime minister, is strongly. I mean, he strongly aligned himself in Ethiopia on the basically the Russian side and the and all that, and they are working towards the SCO and the BRICS and all this. Yeah.
all right,
And potentially, once they get, if, oh, it's a big if the situation stabilizes, but Ethiopia is a potentially rich country. As I said, it had a very high growth rate. It's got a large educated population. It's rich in natural resources. It could, if it gets its act together, become a very, very obvious partner in the BRICS. So we'll see.
the Duran.locals.com. We are also on Rockfin as well, and go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code Good Day. Take care.